The reason this run happened was because of two things. So sit down for a second, you'll get your YouTube video soon. But it's a funny story, and I think you deserve to know the context of why I'm even doing this. Buffmeister. Today he uploads clips of games from a multitude of series, ranging from Final Fantasy, Persona, Silent Hill, and all that. But his main bread and butter, for a long time, was Shin Megami Tensei, both Persona and the mainline games. And for a short period from 2020 to 2022, he did a lot, and I mean a lot, of low-level runs. Now, a low-level run is essentially trying to play the game while obtaining the least amount of experience possible. Though it's easier to just call it a minimum battle challenge, sometimes extra fights are done to get the true ending. Mostly because in Shin Megami Tensei games, doing the true ending has more content and, most importantly, way more difficult boss fights near the end of the game. However, the fundamental philosophy of a low-level run is to completely ignore random encounters, removing experience-based grinding and entering every battle well below the intended level. And for a vast majority of these streams, he had used that rule set to some degree. He was really, really good at what he did. He was probably one of the first people ever to beat Satan from Digital Devil Saga 2. A boss you fight at the end of the game, probably at the max level of 99, with a party of 3, levels 19, 19, and 23 respectively. I know that what I'm saying doesn't sound super impressive, but I swear to you, this is the coolest thing someone has ever done in the history of mankind! There's just one thing Buffmeister couldn't do. There was a single run where he failed to beat it under his self-imposed rule set. The very first game in the Persona franchise. Except, it's the 7th. But that's because it's a remake of the very first Persona game. Unless you count Shin Megami Tensei If as the first Persona game. Which honestly, considering how Persona 1 references that game and even brings back Tamaki, look, there was a single run where he failed to beat it under his self-imposed rule set. Shin Megami Tensei Persona for the PlayStation Portable, or as I keep on calling it, Persona PSP. Dubbed one of the easiest games in the franchise, Persona PSP is not a game you'd expect to be impossible for this run. However, as someone experienced in the game, I know for a fact that if you break away from the standard gameplay of Persona, the game finally bares its teeth. Long story short, Buffmeister did the same challenge we're doing today, albeit with a money cheat to save time on grinding, and did pretty well. However, once they reached the final boss, they hit a wall that was impossible to climb. An instant death machine that did nothing but tell them to try again and again. In the end, there was nothing they could do but give in. They had to use stat boosters and fuse a couple of personas to just barely scrape through the final boss. Though they did beat the game without random encounters, it came at the cost of its integrity, which was unfortunate for me to see. Because I was in that live stream they did the run in. If you look really closely... Oh, see, I'm right there. Look, there, limechips, that's me. While I did hand out a couple tips in the run, I think I popped into the stream a bit too late to actually help them. However, ever since I saw them do that run and completely and utterly fail, it remained in the back of my mind that I knew exactly why they lost. I knew exactly how to win this game. I knew how to beat the unbeatable run. And it took very little theory crafting on my end to do so. The only problem was, actually doing the run. he did that live stream on July 1st of 2022. I put the run of my dreams off for nearly 2 years. This was mostly because I was busy with my final years of high school, and also my waning interest in Persona PSP at this point of time. So what suddenly inspired me to do this run? Did I lay awake at night knowing I could do this run and finally broke under the pressure? Was it because I was getting back into Persona PSP and I got interested in the run again simply by association? Or was it because of a commenter under the name KurtTTG on a video that wasn't even mine that said beating Persona with only the starter Personas was impossible? I spent God knows how many hours on this project and a bunch of money on voice actors just to prove 2 people wrong, and one of them was just some guy. Oh, right. That's right. You thought this was a voice reveal? You thought I sounded this good? I'm not limechips. I'm some person he paid off the internet. Limechips spent $200 on voice actors, all for the sake of proving 2 people wrong. You hear me, KurtTTG? It's not just possible. I nerfed myself just to rub it in. I am the god of Persona PSP. I win.
Right. I never actually explained the rules. I already explained what a low-level run was, but I should explain that final caveat. In the very first Persona game, every single character in the game is a wildcard, meaning they can only use multiple Personas at the same time. It's not as broken as 3, 4, or 5's ability to swap between a dozen or so Personas at the same time, and swapping Personas takes a full turn. Plus, certain party members can't use the Personas of a certain Arcana. For example, the main protagonist can't use a persona of the Hierophant, Death, or Star Arcana, since he has a bad affinity with them. However, for our purposes, every character gets a free persona which they awaken to. Their initial persona, or starter persona as I keep calling it. The game is designed for you to eventually fuse your original persona away, and instead fuse much more powerful ones to get through the game. However, we're going to completely ignore that game mechanic. The Velvet Room in its entirety is banned to us. This is going to be the main inhibitor of this challenge, more so than us being restricted to battles and experience, because we're using personas you'd get at the very beginning of the game. Our skills are extremely limited, our damage is a fraction of what it could be, our stats aren't getting boosted by the personas we're using after a certain point in the game, and we can't swap affinities to resist a boss's potential haymaker, and much, much more. However, Persona 1 low-level starter personas is a mouthful. So let's just abbreviate it, and make starter personas one word, and boom! This is the pills challenge. That's what it's called. I've wasted enough time explaining the rules and why they matter. After the intro cutscene and all that nonsense, and naming ourselves accordingly, we can finally begin the run.
Splendid.
I don't want to explain the plot of Persona PSP, mostly because that's not what I'm here for, and probably what you're not here for either. So when I jump from one boss fight to another in a short period, or don't mention every detail of my dungeon crawl, that's why. Just know that right now we're visiting our friend in the hospital. She has cancer. That kind of sucks. But she doesn't have to worry about that anymore. Because the world ends. Caught up? Good. Discussing the first dungeon is pretty crucial, as it has our first 2 battles, with heavy quotations around the word battle. The 2 unavoidable battles within the hospital automatically play on their own and are essentially just glorified cutscenes. These battles do give us a free level, which, considering the fact we're not killing anything outside of these battles, is useful for our build. Said build for our protagonist is going to be really simple. Agility. It's just going to be agility. This stat is so important that if we don't reach a certain threshold before the final boss, this run will be impossible. Buffmeister's main roadblock was them not investing in this soul stat. Despite how much I'm hyping this stat up though, I won't spoil why it's so imperative to raise this. It's not useful right now to explain it when I can just do that later. However, if you've read the descriptions for my other Persona 1 challenge runs, or seen the Yukino video I made, it should be very clear what I'm aiming for. I will explain why the other 4 stats aren't exactly useful to me. Strength increases the damage of our physical attacks and only our physical attacks. It's useful for the final boss due to their weakness against physical attacks, but not for our protagonist. For you see, he won't be fighting the final boss at all. We have much more capable people in the future who will be taking the front lines in that battle, meaning we should instead focus on people who are going to support the party. Strength is fundamentally useless to the protagonist then. Dexterity would technically be the best dump stat, as it increases both gun damage and magical damage. And the main character isn't a slouch with a gun, the SMG is a fantastic weapon to use. It's so fantastic that whenever I do want the protagonist to fight, they're going to be using their gun exclusively. As for their magic damage, no. Their persona only has 2 magical moves, Garu and Magaru. Relying on light damage when magic in any fight is stupid, when you have much better options with other party members. Finally, even if the protagonist's dexterity was high, and their magic was decent, it still wouldn't be a good idea. Simply because, in all honesty, dexterity can only influence our damage output so much with magic. It isn't our raw stats that contribute to magic attacks, it's the persona we use. Same in Kongo, the protagonist starter persona, only has a magic stat of 65. This will only increase once we rank up our persona, but it'll eventually cap. And because this persona is meant for literally the very start of the game and nothing else, relying on magic damage will eventually prove to be fruitless, as the damage from our guns and physical weapons gets improved throughout the run to the point of dwarfing magic entirely. Same problem with strength as well. We can't rely on the main protagonist for damage. They're going to be focusing on a support role for us to win this run. Though I did consider dumping into this stat when I reached my threshold, I discovered a better stat to put points into. That stat, of course, isn't Vitality is a very useful stat, don't get me wrong. Surviving a lot of the bosses or even just random encounters is going to be difficult the more the game progresses and the more under-leveled we are. However, there is one major problem with Vitality. It hardly raises your defense, even when you put investment into it. It gives you more HP, sure. However, and you're going to hear this same similar line again, what contributes the most to your defense is not your stats, it's your persona. Magic defense is far more important than any other form of defense in this entire game because if you couldn't guess, a lot of enemies use magic in this game. Physical skills honestly kind of suck in Persona PSP, for both players and enemies. With only a base magic defense stat of 46, along with being severely underdeveloped, our protagonist is not going to be surviving anything worth mentioning without the assistance of muscle drinks or armor. Plus, having him be the sole survivor is not exactly a good game plan. He will be one of, if not the most important party members to keep alive later in the game, but by that time, he's going to have a far greater alternative solution to his lackluster bulk. Anyway, that dumb stat I mentioned earlier, if it isn't strength, dexterity, or vitality, then there's only one sole stat to put any excess points into. Luck. Of all things, luck. Entirely for one reason, it increases our avoidance rate. It's not very likely to happen, but because we invested a lot of points into agility, it's not entirely too bad of an idea to invest in luck simply to dodge things. I don't like the idea of relying on luck for a strategy, and trust me, it won't be. But there are times when enemies will move before us no matter how much investment we put in, so having a way to get lucky in an unlucky scenario is one I'm willing to take. Along with that, out of all the stats to consider other than agility, this one is the easiest to invest in late in the game, while also serving our goals and strategies. That's the crux of my build for this challenge run, and the sole decision to go for an agility build, as I stated before, will result in us winning this run. At least, I thought it would be in my planning phase. Now that we're done talking about stats, it's time to, discuss even more boring stuff like how we'll deal with all the random encounters. Because I don't have a mod installed to completely ignore random encounters, we're going to have to develop a strategy against most demons. Now, while running away from battles is our primary solution, we're eventually going to reach a point where running away is impossible. I think this is because of our party's overall agility stat being far too low to escape most fights, or it could be some other factor. Either way, after a certain point in the game, the escape button is going to be a wasted action, and one that might end in our party's immediate death. That's why we have to invest in one of two alternatives to combat. Demon negotiation. Talking it out, speaking man-to-man, mano a mano. No matter what level you are, charm isn't a stat, it's a life skill. This is our only consistent option for getting out of battles. However, learning what options to go for will be our primary concern. As much as making them eager or filling up the yellow gauge is useful, it's also an automatic reset in some scenarios. If you excite these demons enough, there's a slim chance they'll give you experience. In a challenge run where we want to avoid any optional experience. Do you realize the problem here? The easiest way to solve this is just telling them to leave instead of asking for anything, but making demons excited is also a pain without a guide on hand. And when I started this run, it had been over a year since I last played Persona PSP, so I had to go for an alternate solution to most fights. That being, making them happy and angry. That's right, we're pissing demons off while also giving them a good time. It's the most valid strategy against most fights anyway. It's extremely easy to make demons angry since there are a lot more wrong options than right when it comes to negotiating with these things. And compared to making demons eager, making demons happy is far, far more likely and feasible. And there's no luck part to it, as long as you have the right moon phase. Which is a game mechanic so stupid that wasting time talking about it is, as I just stated, a waste of time. They won't just hand you a million billion XP for listening to their sad story about how their aunt died in a freak Persona-related car crash. They just leave, because they find you annoying. Our only problem with this method is that if we fail to annoy the demon enough to leave us alone, we're essentially screwed. The game makes it physically impossible to talk to a demon you've already had a conversation with when you cap out its happiness, eagerness, anger, or fear for you. However, before that ever becomes a major issue, we will obtain a second alternative to combat. I just won't discuss it yet because we haven't obtained it, also because it deserves a rant of its own. Anyway, that was a lot of things to discuss in the very first dungeon. That's because there's nothing important to do in this dungeon, especially because we're ignoring every optional encounter here. While I could talk about the party members we get here, once this dungeon is over, they'll all be removed from the party, barring the main character. 2 of them will return to our squad, but I'll discuss them when it's their time to shine. The hospital's layout isn't tricky enough to not just blitz through it, and the enemies we do fight here aren't strong enough to make escape difficult. Sooner than later, we enter Force Battle number 2 of the run. This one, as stated previously, is a glorified cutscene that gives us another level, just so we can dip 3 more points into agility. Once we're done with that, we do some other plot nonsense that we are skipping as I speak. Just move over there, and boom, we return back to Stay Amerlin High School to steal from the local club rooms. We're going to need any free gear we can get because our money is going to be very, very limited before the end of the 3rd dungeon. And because negotiating with demons for money leads to the possibility of getting unintentional XP, we can't rely on that for all our funds. Our money problems are going to be solved soon in a very, very effective manner. Till then, we're stealing from local high schools. After we're done stealing because we have nothing else to do, we finally go with our route of choice, the Sepik route. At this point, because it's the end of the tutorial, I want to actually discuss the party members we have. I think I've done enough explaining for the protagonist, at least to some degree, but at this point we unlock our first 2 forced party members of the run. At least another glorified cutscene of a battle marking battle number 3 for the run. Kei Nanjo of the Hierophant Arcana and Maki Sonomura of the Priestess Arcana. Let's discuss them while we skip past the whole police station dungeon. Trust me, you're not missing much.
Let's fight like gentlemen.
Nanjo is forced into our party on this route, but even if he wasn't, I would have taken him any day of the week over most of these goons. He's single-handedly our main negotiator, as for some godforsaken reason, his kit is fantastic at either making demons happy and or eager, or pissing them off. Both are useful when you just want enemies to leave you alone more than anything. Not only that, every aspect of Nanjo can be deemed, in our run, useful. His rifle is solid, allowing him to hit enemies multiple times for pretty good damage, even from the very back of the party formation. His sword can multi-hit and rival Mark's axe in raw power depending on how many blows he gets in. His persona, as in Mule, although not really having strong offensive moves, still has insanely good support skills and affinities. It even comes with Tsukakaja and Makikaja, two buff skills which will be very useful in the future. This basically ensures that no matter what stage of the game you use Aizen Mule, it'll still have some viability to it. Even the stats he grows are fantastic, with him having a focus on vitality, strength, and agility. While I personally view strength as the worst stat in this game, more damage for his already good melee weapon is not something I'm going to pass up. Plus, with his growths, he's actually got enough vitality to be considered our tank. Ensuring that, when the worst comes to worst, Nanjo will help bring us back up again. His only weakness, at least in this run, is that he's extremely vulnerable to physical attacks, with a weakness in essentially all forms of physical damage. This can prove to be detrimental, considering we mostly want him on the front lines, but with a dedicated healer or two, that extra damage is solved. Honestly, Nanjo is S tier, and if not that, a high A tier. He's a solid 9 out of 10 for this run, and I'm honestly ashamed I didn't give him so much credit in my first starter Persona's only run. However, paired with Nanjo is Maki, and she's basically the second protagonist of this route. So how good is she? I won't lie to you, Maki is kind of, well, meh. In the early game, she's essential, no doubt about it. She's the only mandatory party member that has Dia on her, allowing us to heal during bosses and out of combat without items. This in a sense is really good, because as I keep stating, money is tight in the early game. She comes with a medium damage ice skill, which will serve its purpose against some early game bosses. Especially one of them though for a really stupid reason. However, her usefulness dies around mid to late game, as she is more of an item slave than anything else. She doesn't get anything like media, meaning she can only heal one person at a time with her magic. And speaking of her magic, it doesn't scale well because unlike melee weapons and guns, we can't buy a better persona in this starter personas only run. We can buy magic stones. However, their damage actually scales off the power of your persona, just like regular magic. Essentially, it's still not as effective as we wish it could be. She does fill a very weird niche of being the best user of these stones, but stones are extremely expensive. And there's not a single boss in this game that requires stones, with the final boss actually making stones a burden if used. Even with a good dexterity stat, even with the stones being high tier magic, they're still pretty bad honestly. Also, she's the worst negotiator in the party. 3 of her talk options nearly every time I've used them have led to the demon being pissed off at us. You could say it's useful if we want to make a demon both happy and pissed, but we have 4 other characters to use that do her job infinitely better. Her affinities are actually pretty decent however, as her only real weakness is a 25% weakness to fire, death, or curse attacks. She resists nearly every other magic in the game, drains ice and expel, and even has a resistance to ailments. Plus her stat focuses are agility, luck, and dexterity. This means she actually has a somewhat decent chance to avoid attacks, which is useful against random encounters. And one more thing, she uses a handgun. Straight up. Which, when given the necessary funds, can actually serve as a really good source of damage, even if she's not the strongest with the gun we could use. However, by the time you get the best gun for her, it's time for the game to end. Though I will say it will at least be useful, albeit very limited. Overall, she's situational. She's the second worst party member, with the main character overall being worse than her in most aspects. However, just like how he's essential to our team, so is Maki. So she's like a solid 5 or 6 out of 10. Oh, while we were busy talking about anime characters in a video game, we made it to the end of the dungeon. Here we finally gain access to our 4th party member, Masao Inaba, or Mark as this game calls him. But before anything else happens, we get caught by the police chief for breaking Mark out of prison. Oh right, that was the plot. We were committing a crime. We were breaking someone out of jail. 2 people out of jail, actually. Because we committed a felony, we entered our 4th mandatory battle. However, just like the ones before this, it's a glorified cutscene. However, this glorified cutscene is a bit more important than the other glorified cutscenes. In every single battle so far, each of the characters has awakened and used their persona. You see, these are technically the only freebies we'll ever get in this game, as them using their persona in a cutscene raises its rank. I know I've mentioned ranking up personas every now and then, but because this mechanic is completely missing in Persona 3, 4, 5, Persona 5 Dancing, Persona 5 Tacticia, Persona 5 Strikers, Persona 5 The Phantom X, Persona 5... Because this mechanic is completely missing in the mainline Persona games, I should quickly explain what ranking up a persona even means. To put it simply, a persona does not have access to all their skills initially. It's why when you gain access to a new persona, their skill pool is laughably small. However, the more you use a persona in combat, the more they rank up, and depending on the persona, at certain ranks, you gain new skills. Along with this, the persona gives you enhanced stats when you rank it up, sort of similar to armor giving you extra stats. Except instead of adding onto a stat, they outright change the character's stat to that of the persona, unless the character using that persona has a higher stat than the persona. I know that was a really weird way to word it, but picture it like this. Imagine the protagonist has an agility stat of 99, while the persona he uses has an agility stat of 10. The protagonist's agility stat of 99 will, of course, stay at 99. However, if the main protagonist has a strength stat of 5, and the persona he's using has a strength stat of 99, the protagonist now has a strength stat of 99 with his persona equipped. This is no doubt a very useful mechanic. Unfortunately, we can't abuse it too much because we're using the very first personas you get at the beginning of the game. Because we're using the personas we awakened at the very start of the game instead of using new ones, the stats we gain are minimal at best, and the skills we acquire are meant for the very beginning of the game. Despite this, ranking up the persona of every party member we have is going to be our main priority in every single boss fight, more so than winning the battle. We need as many skills as we can get so we can at least have some options against future bosses. This is especially important for Nanjo, who needs to get Makikaja and Tsukukaja before the final 2 bosses. With how few battles we're going to have in this game, we need to min-max every single one we get to. The entire reason I brought this up is that in this glorified cutscene of a battle, every single party member uses their persona in battle. That's it. That's why we went on this long tangent about persona ranks. This thankfully means that everyone in our party reached rank 3 out of 8 total ranks, thanks to everyone using their persona in a previous battle. The only person who didn't reach rank 3 is that guy. That guy, right there. Yeah, he was also in the fight. We're going to ignore him. He's completely irrelevant to this run. Why did we even break him out of jail? Anyway, we can finally discuss our newest party member who is also forced into our party. Masao Inaba, or Mark, of the Chariot Arcana. Mark is very similar to the protagonist, both in story and gameplay. However, we don't care about the story, so let's talk about him in this run. He's like the protagonist in the sense that he sucks. His persona, Ogun, sucks, and none of the skills he gets even at rank 8 will make it worth using. He will more than likely die due to everything because we force him on the front lines in every single battle. His gun is quite possibly the worst gun in the game, since shotguns are weaker than handguns for some reason. Using him for demon contracts or negotiations is pointless most of the time since we have Nanjo. Though he does have his uses against a select few demon types, but against a majority of foes, he's not good. And yet, despite sucking at literally everything, there's one single defining aspect about him that completely salvages him. When visiting a cancer patient in the hospital, he for some reason brought an axe with him. The axe is the strongest physical attack we have in this entire run. In fact, it's the strongest attack we have in the entire run, period. It's got a decent enough hit rate where missing with his weapon isn't too much of a problem, and its damage output is insane, at least for us, despite it not having any multi-hit functions. Because of its limited range, Mark is forced to be at the front lines, which is awful for him because enemies love to target him. However, despite everything, you just can't beat the fact that he has one single job this entire run, and it's just to hit the enemy as hard as possible. For that, he's better than Maki at least. Good for him. But he's far from being great, so he's a 6 out of 10.
Now that we have Mark, we have the option to select one more party member before the next dungeon. With a grand total of 4 of them, and considering we can't remove party members once we obtain them, this should be an interesting discussion. However, 2 of the 4 party members will actively detriment us if we use them. Hidehiko Uesugi, or Brown for short. The guy we just helped break out of prison earlier. He's essentially just a slightly better version of the main character. However, you have to consider this. Being a 3 out of 10 is not much better than being a 2 out of 10. We're not using him. The same can be said about the other potential party member we can recruit, Yuka Ayase. While she does have her strengths, she's honestly just a worse version of Maki. We also have to consider one more thing. The first boss for this run is going to genuinely be difficult with a lack of healing items and levels behind us, meaning Reiji Kido, who we would have probably recruited 9 times out of 10 to be our 5th party member, is also out of the running. If he joined us before the first boss, that'd be great. He is actually the best party member in the entire game, at least for this run. But right now, when we're focusing on just barely scraping through any fights we get into, there's only one party member who'd be worth the effort. And thankfully, she's the second best party member in the game. After breaking free from the police station and avoiding every encounter we possibly can, we head straight to the subway entrance. There, we find the MVP of this run, Eriko Kirishima, or Ellie, of the Judgment Arcana. A lot of party members in this game share a lot of attributes with each other, at least in this run, to the point that some starter personas, at least gameplay-wise, are extremely similar. Ellie is no different as, in battle, she and Nanjo have the same sort of approach to combat. They both wield swords and rifles, though Ellie's one-handed sword is far worse than Nanjo's two-handed sword in nearly every aspect. They're both the only party members in the entire game with any form of buffing skills. However, Nanjo has Tsukukaja, a skill that raises accuracy, and Makikaja, a skill that raises magic damage. Ellie has the holy grail of buff skills in Rakukaja, a skill that buffs defense. This is invaluable considering how much damage we're going to be taking from future bosses. Any way to soften the blow is going to be useful for the future. She's also pretty decent when it comes to her persona's offensive magic, wielding 2 multi-target elemental skills in the form of Mighty Wave and Eastern Impact, dealing ice and blast damage respectively. Even though she's 1 rank behind Maki, she'll gain access to Dia in her next rank up, allowing her to act as a healing bot in and out of combat, and I won't say no to a second healer in our forces. Essentially, with just these skills and tools alone, she's capable of dealing decent damage in combat. She has better buff skills than Nanjo. She can serve as a healer like Maki, and she has some of the best magic we can get at this point of the game if we just train her a small bit. But what if I were to tell you that there's just one more thing about her that moves from a solid 9 out of 10 to a flat out 10? I've not talked much about elemental affinities, mostly because we haven't actually gotten to the bosses. So discussing what each member of the party is weak against would be useless now. But for Ellie's persona, Nike, there's no reason to worry about elemental weaknesses. She has the exact same resistances and weaknesses as Nanjo's Aizen Mule, with her being weak to every form of physical damage. However, Nanjo simply resists all forms of magic in this game. Ellie takes it one step further. Except for death and curse attacks, which deal double damage to her, Ellie is immune to all forms of magic in this game. And yes, that includes ailments. In a game where magic is the best form of damage, period, having an innate immunity to all of it, except for the rare death of a curse attack, makes Ellie our tank. If the enemy can't deal damage to her, we cannot lose. She'll be on the back lines, where she'll be soaking up the least amount of hits, however, entirely due to her weakness due to physical damage. But against every single boss of the game, right to the final boss, we've essentially guaranteed that we're going to win. Her only weakness is that, at the very start of the run, her persona is effectively useless, as Koha, her only skill, till rank 3, can't actually deal damage to any of the bosses. But that just means we have to spam that one move till she learns Rakakaja, and then it's smooth sailing from there. Ellie is either the second best party member in the game, or the very best, and she's going to be vital to us completing this run. So keep her in mind whenever we get into a boss fight. Eriko Kirishima is our team's MVP.
Now that we have Ellie and our party is complete, all that awaits us is going through the next dungeon. And for once, it's an actual challenge worth discussing. Before this, every battle was solved easily by just running away from it. However, for some reason, the game decided to rack up the enemy quality a bit, and now running away is a pipe dream. We don't have an alternative means of escape yet, meaning if we can't run away from every fight, our only fallback is to negotiate with the enemy and tell them to please leave us alone. Sometimes we get lucky and the enemy leaves on their own accord. However, for practically every other encounter, we're throwing Nanjo in the front lines hoping he either annoys the enemy to death or bribes them enough for them to bail. After quickly moving through the demons in the basement of the dungeon, we're finally allowed to enter the dungeon proper, the Sepik building. You're given one free save spot, and if you fail a single demon interaction within here, you're going straight back there. This section at the beginning of the game was like a quick tutorial and refresher to make me remember what demon types react to what in demon negotiations. It taught me two things. 1. Don't ever ask for compensation from them. They're literal demons. While them giving me money wasn't too unlikely, and did help just barely pay for the healing I needed for trudging this hell, they just kept giving me experience. That or they outright murdered me, forcing me to constantly reset back to the last save point. Thankfully, this section of the dungeon isn't too long, and we're able to loot a couple of new guns and some ammo to assist us in the next boss fight. But it practically demands perfection from you, constantly inching forward only to run back to the save room with any bit of progress we make slowly adding up. After selling a lot of our junk and using the scraps we got from lucky moments in demon negotiation, I was able to purchase a good amount of healing items for when we eventually ran out of SP to cast spells, which will be useful. When we reach the boss, Takeda and his 4 henchmen, we get curb stomped on the first attempt.
Takeda for the first boss of the game isn't too bad. He only has 720 HP and 56 magic defense. A weakness to swords and ice makes it easy to deal decent damage to him, with the only relevant resistance to us being a 50% resistance to all gun attacks. The only move he has that can hit multiple foes is Earthly Vortex, a medium damage wind move that can, at most, hit 3 people at once. However, because that attack uses wind, literally everyone except Mark either resists it, reflects it, or nulls it. Of course, if the attack hits Mark, he dies nearly instantly due to his weakness to wind, but we're going to have to get used to that. No, the main threat isn't Takeda, it's the fact that he evened the numbers out by bringing 4 agents. Each of them has about 222 HP, meaning Takeda and his 4 pals have a combined 1608 HP. And killing Takeda before the agents, albeit possible, isn't advised. Every single enemy we fight here uses either gun attacks or physical moves, which no one in my party has any resistance to. In fact, Maki, Nanjo, and Ellie's persona are weak to only one gun type in the entire game: machine guns. Can you guess what gun these agents brought to this battle? And though they deal small bits of damage each turn, it's hard to heal everyone in our party at once, as all forms of healing we have at this point only focus on one person a turn. Eventually, Mark will more than likely die to Takeda going for Earthly Vortex, and Maki will, if she gets unlucky, get hit by a machine gun once or twice and go down. Suffice it to say that Takeda is an actual challenge to us. The main problem is this: our party members are dying. We only get so many battles in this game, and being dead during most of a boss fight will heavily reduce the amount of experience a party member gains if we win. This wouldn't be a problem if we had plenty of revival items, however, we only have 7 revival beads. My first attempt ended very abruptly, with me running out of enough beads to revive everyone in my party, which required me to, actually think for once in my life. My party formation hadn't changed much this entire game, mostly because I never had to think about fighting before this. But now that I'm in my first real fight of the game, about 11 levels or so below what was expected of me, I got to tinkering with it. I call this party formation the conga line of doom. Generally speaking, Mark will die first. However, he's most effective at the front lines, so it's ineffective to place him at the back. Even if he wanted to use his persona, his only move is Flurry Stab, which still requires him to be at the front. If we want to train Mark, he needs to be in no man's land. That's why I slapped him smack dab at the center of the front, followed by the protagonist, who will reflect any wind damage that gets targeted at Mark for a small bit of damage. For this fight, we might as well optimize Mark's impending doom in any way we can. Plus, this gives the protagonist a good spot to use his SMG when he's done casting Garu. Then, at the very back of the formation, Nanjo, Maki, and Ellie focus on casting magic. These 3 are the most vulnerable to the boss, meaning we need them far back for as long as possible to avoid either getting punched or getting shot. With this formation complete and generally me feeling more prepared, I re-enter Takeda's, intending to harvest as much as I possibly can from this one fight with any means necessary. Nanjo and Ellie cannot actually do anything meaningful with their persona until they spam Hama and Koha, 2 completely useless skills, enough to get to rank 4 and 3 respectively, with Nanjo being at rank 3 and Ellie at rank 2. However, it thankfully won't take much in the first dozen or so turns for them to finally contribute to the fight. With the idea that we're spending this first battle training Nanjo and Ellie, it lies on Mark, Maki, and the protagonist to be using either magic or weapons to take down the agents. However, since we're going to eventually lose health over the course of the battle, it's up to Maki to focus on using Maso and spamming Dia on anyone she possibly can. This leaves just 2 people on offense against 5 enemies. Mark's Ogun and the protagonist's Seimen Kongo are far from the strongest combatants we can have, but spamming Flurry Stab and Garu is better than doing nothing at all. I make the protagonist and Mark focus on the bottom right agent first, since their gun could potentially snipe Ellie. I wasn't worried about Nanjo getting shot, as his bulk was more than decent enough even at this level to handle a couple of blows. Ellie's survival was the main concern here. However, attacking them served to pose its own problem in itself. Due to our generally lower level, hitting the enemy with our attacks actually posed to be a greater problem than expected. Along with that, Flurry Stab just sucks as a move. It practically outright misses half the time. However, considering it's the only heavy damage move we get in this entire game, despite it being on a below average persona, we're going to make full use of it in this fight. Thankfully, there was some hope in this situation, as relatively quickly, I'm talking the second turn, Ellie's persona Nike reached rank 3. Ellie, now knowing Dia, acted as our second healer, with both her and Maki respectively healing 2 party members to near full HP a turn. An essential upgrade to us, as it allowed Ellie to continue training her persona while also making sure we could actually survive the fight. Just as this happened, the protagonist nearly died to 2 drive shots from the agents. However, he just barely survived on 1 HP. I set Maki to heal him, however Maki had less agility than the agent, meaning it was totally possible for him to die. But thankfully, 1 agent shot Mark instead of the protagonist. The second agent actually did shoot the protagonist, but he just barely missed, letting Maki heal up. After this, Nanjo casts 1 more Hama to get to rank 4, unlocking Tsukakaja, solving our issue with our albeit shaky hit rate against this and future bosses. The first 3 turns focused entirely on the growth of 2 party members at the expense of our general combat performance. However, now with Nanjo and Ellie playing a supportive role, our survivability goes drastically up. Maki and Ellie are both acting as healers, keeping everyone alive. Nanjo focuses on spamming Tsukakaja, not just when we get to 2 stacks, which is the max, but also when a character dies. He's immediately going to use it again to get their hit rate back up to stuff. Any valid excuse we can get to use his persona, he will.
In any instance, he's not using Tsukakaja, he's going to be gunning the enemies from the back with his rifle. Further into the battle, Ellie heals enough to finally unlock Rakukaja, our best buff for the entire run, which I have already discussed how useful this will be. But not too long after that, Takeda casted Earthly Vortex while Mark was in the red, and with no real hope of dodging it, Mark went down as the first real death for this fight. Because of how the party was formed, once the turn was over, everyone in the party actually moved forward to our benefit. You see, the conga line of Doom was built with the specific purpose of keeping our squishier units in the back until they got stronger. However, Takeda delayed using Earthly Vortex for so long that Maki, Nanjo, and Ellie were more than capable of heading more towards the center. With 2 stacks of Rakukaja and 2 healers on deck, spreading out the damage between all 5 party members instead of it being focused on the protagonist and Mark finally benefited us. However, this meant we couldn't revive Mark onto the center, where he had the best access to all the enemies. Luckily for us, we could just pin him to the right, where he prioritized taking down the henchman in the bottom right corner. After another near-death experience for the protagonist, Nanjo was able to take out the first agent in the bottom right corner. With the newly acquired Grai from Mark's Ogun, the bottom left agent then followed suit. Just a bit more time later, after a Garu from the protagonist Seimen Kongo, the top right agent soon joined their brothers. And with one more Grai from Mark, the final agent was dead, meaning the main threat of this battle was just Takeda, who, at this stage of the fight, with our heavily trained party, was a complete joke. I moved the party around to put Nanjo in the front and Mark near the center so that a combined normal attack and Earthly Vortex wouldn't waste a revival bead. Maki did die near the end, which did mean we had to use 2 revival beads. Though considering we only had Mark die once this entire battle, and with how many close calls we had, it was totally acceptable. 28 minutes into the fight, with one more swing of his sword, the protagonist gutted Takeda like a fish. Finally ending the first true battle of this entire run. I just want to say we got 4 levels worth of experience from that fight, which is absurd. Of course, that's just another way of saying we just earned 12 more points of agility. Anyway, killing a man behind closed doors leads us to getting sent to an alternate universe.
Got to cut it out, help.
Stop.
into the clay, and the woman came to life. Aphrodite made her beautiful, and Hermes taught her how to be both charming and deceitful. Zeus called her Pandora.